Imagine you have been invited to the most historically significant dinner in all of human history. You arrive at the door, you knock, and someone opens it. And instead of a grand hall with chandeliers and a banquet table stretching the length of a palace, you find a small, warm, dimly lit room. The floor is covered with woven cushions. A low table sits in the center crowded with clay bowls. The smell of slow-cooked beans and roasted fish drifts through the air. A cup of dark wine is being passed from hand to hand. Nobody is wearing fine clothes. Nobody is seated on a throne. And yet, every single person in that room is about to be part of a moment that will echo through 2,000 years of human civilization. You were expecting a feast fit for kings. What you found instead was Tuesday night dinner. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly the point. In first-century Palestine, bread was not simply a side dish or an accompaniment to the main course. It was the meal itself. Every household, whether wealthy or impoverished, whether in a bustling city like Jerusalem or a quiet fishing village on the shores of Galilee, began and ended its day with bread. The grain used was primarily wheat for those who could afford it, and barley for the poorer families who made up the overwhelming majority of the population. Women would wake before sunrise, grind the grain between two heavy stones, mix the dough with water and a small amount of fermented starter, and bake the loaves on hot clay surfaces or in simple clay ovens built into the walls of their homes. Because there were no preservatives and no means of long-term storage, this process was repeated every single day without exception. Bread was the vehicle through which everything else was eaten. Stews were scooped with torn pieces of flatbread, oils were soaked into it, and even the simplest meals of salt or olives were consumed alongside a loaf. The Hebrew scriptures repeatedly use bread as a metaphor for survival, sustenance, and divine provision, precisely because in the lived daily experience of ordinary people that metaphor required no explanation whatsoever. To be without bread was to be without life. Archaeological discoveries throughout the region have confirmed massive grain storage facilities, communal grinding areas, and bread-baking tools as among the most common domestic artifacts found at first-century Jewish settlement sites. This was not a culture that thought of bread as optional or ceremonial. It was the caloric backbone of an entire civilization, consumed morning, midday, and evening, shared between family members and strangers alike with an openness that itself carried deep cultural and spiritual significance in that ancient world. For centuries, artists, theologians, and scholars have imagined the Last Supper through the lens of their own cultural context, filling the table with foods familiar to their own time and place rather than investigating what would have actually been present in a first-century Jewish Passover meal setting in Jerusalem. However, serious historical and archaeological scholarship has worked to reconstruct a far more accurate picture of what that meal likely involved. Two Italian archaeologists drew upon a remarkable range of sources, including specific Bible passages, ancient Jewish religious texts, Roman culinary literature, and physical archaeological evidence recovered from digs around Jerusalem and the broader Levantine region, to piece together a credible and detailed hypothesis. Their reconstruction placed bean stew prominently on the table, a thick and hearty preparation of slow-cooked legumes that was entirely consistent with both the season and the economic realities of the people present. Lamb was also identified as a likely centerpiece, consistent with Passover tradition as outlined in Mosaic law, which required the sacrifice and consumption of a lamb as a memorial to the exodus from Egypt. Bitter herbs were present in accordance with the same Passover ritual requirements, their sharpness meant to evoke the suffering of slavery and the urgency of departure. Unleavened bread replaced the ordinary leavened loaves as the Passover feast specifically prohibited any fermented grain products in observance of the biblical narrative. Fish sauce, in the form of the locally adapted Roman condiment, added depth and saltiness to the meal. Dates provided sweetness, and aromatized wine infused with spices and herbs, completed the menu. This reconstruction transforms the Last Supper from a vague spiritual symbol into a tangible, historically grounded human meal, with specific tastes, textures, and aromas rooted entirely in the material culture of its time and geography. Perhaps no single misconception about the meals of first-century Judea has been more powerfully reinforced by Western cultural imagery than the idea of a long, rectangular table with formally seated figures arranged in neat rows. This image, immortalized most famously in Renaissance painting, tells us far more about 15th-century European dining conventions than it does about the actual physical setting of a meal in ancient Jerusalem or Galilee. The historical reality was dramatically different and, in many ways, far more intimate. Under the profound cultural influence of the Roman Empire, which had thoroughly penetrated the dining customs of the entire Mediterranean world, including Judea, the practice of reclining at meals had become widespread and socially established. Guests would gather in a room where low tables were set, close to the floor, and they would recline on cushions, carpets, or padded mats arranged around the perimeter of the food. The body would rest on the left elbow, leaving the right hand free to reach for bread, dip into stews, or accept a shared cup of wine. This posture was not considered casual or disrespectful. In the Greco-Roman world, reclining to eat was actually a marker of freedom and dignity, a posture deliberately contrasted with the upright, hurried eating of servants and slaves. In the context of the Passover meal specifically, reclining carried additional symbolic weight, representing the freedom of a liberated people who no longer ate in the anxious, rushed manner of those still in bondage. The physical closeness created by this arrangement, bodies near one another, hands reaching across the same shared dishes, faces at the same low level, created a quality of intimacy and equality that a formal seated banquet simply cannot replicate, and that intimacy was entirely intentional in the culture that practiced it. The Sea of Galilee, known in Hebrew as the Kinneret, was not merely a scenic body of water in the background of the gospel narratives. It was an economic engine, a food source of enormous importance for the entire surrounding region and the workplace of a significant portion of the local population. Archaeological excavations conducted throughout the Galilee region and in the ancient port town of Magdala have uncovered substantial evidence of a thriving fish industry, including large-scale processing facilities where fish were salted, dried, and prepared for transport and sale across the region and beyond. Among the species identified, through bone remains and ancient textual references, St. Peter's fish, a tilapia known today by that name largely because of its association with the gospel stories, was one of the most commonly consumed. Mouthbreeders and various other freshwater species were also regularly caught and eaten. Fish would have been consumed in multiple forms in a typical household. Fresh fish grilled over an open flame was common in coastal and lakeside communities, while dried and salted fish was the form in which it traveled inland to towns and villages further from the water. This salted fish was affordable, portable, long-lasting, and protein-rich, exactly the qualities a population without refrigeration required in a daily food source. Beyond freshwater fish, evidence suggests that some coastal fish products also made their way into the inland markets of Judea through established trade routes. Fish was not a luxury or a special occasion, food in this context. It was an everyday protein that appeared on ordinary tables with great regularity, eaten with bread, dipped in oil or sauce, and shared without ceremony among family members gathered at the end of a working day in a small, warm, lamp-lit home. To understand the diet of first-century observant Jewish people, one cannot separate the food from the religious and legal framework that governed every aspect of its selection, preparation, and consumption. The system of dietary laws known as kashrut, derived from the Torah, specifically from detailed passages in the books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, established a comprehensive set of rules that defined which foods were permissible and which were forbidden, and how permissible foods were to be handled and prepared. Among land animals, only those that both chew their cud and have split hooves were considered kosher, which permitted beef, goat, and lamb while prohibiting pork and rabbit, among many others. Seafood was restricted to fish with both fins and scales, making shrimp, crab, lobster, and catfish entirely off-limits. Birds of prey were forbidden, while domesticated birds such as chicken and dove were permitted. One of the most practically significant rules involved the complete separation of meat and dairy products, which could not be cooked together, eaten together, or prepared using the same utensils. A prohibition derived from the repeated biblical instruction not to boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Blood was strictly forbidden in any form, which meant that all meat had to be slaughtered in a specific ritual manner by a trained individual, and then salted and soaked to draw out any remaining blood before cooking. These were not casual guidelines or cultural preferences. They were religious obligations that shaped every meal, every market visit, every kitchen arrangement, and every dinner invitation. For deeply observant Jewish men living in first-century Judea, these laws were as natural and non-negotiable as breathing, woven completely into the rhythms of daily domestic life. It is a common assumption that the people of first-century Judea, particularly those who were devoutly Jewish and culturally resistant to Roman occupation, would have maintained a completely separate and untouched food culture entirely distinct from anything Roman. The historical reality, as archaeology and textual evidence repeatedly confirm, is considerably more nuanced and interesting. The Roman Empire did not merely occupy the land of Judea. It saturated its markets, its trade routes, its building practices, and inevitably, its cuisine. One of the most striking examples of this culinary crossover is the presence of fish sauce at Jewish tables throughout the region. The Romans were deeply devoted to garum, a pungent, intensely flavored liquid made from fermented fish entrails that was used as a seasoning in almost every category of Roman cooking. In Judea, a local adaptation of this condiment called zir had developed, made from kosher fish and prepared in accordance with Jewish dietary laws, which allowed it to be used freely by observant Jewish households. Historical researchers have identified this condiment as likely present at significant meals throughout the Gospel narratives, including the wedding feast at Cana, the banquet of Herod, and the Last Supper itself. Beyond fish sauce, Roman influence showed up in the reclining dining posture already discussed, in certain wine, preparation and aromatization techniques, and in the broader trade in preserved and processed foods that moved through Roman-administered market networks. This does not represent a surrender of Jewish identity. It represents the entirely natural and inevitable process by which cultures absorb and adapt elements from their environment while maintaining the core of their own distinct traditions, a process that has always defined how human beings actually live their daily lives.